This podcast is Challenging Opinions and is presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading the Challenging Opinions podcast for September 23rd, 2019. There were many historical injustices in the United States, and people have different ideas about how or whether they can be redressed in the present day. In this podcast, I'm talking to an advocate for this and asking what's to be done.
Challenging Opinions is the podcast where ideas are tested. Whether you are left or right, conservative or progressive, devout or skeptic. What matters is the strength of your argument, not the strength of your voice.
Coming up on today's podcast, the only criteria for above all a doctor is whether they can do the job.
Right. And we believe that it's not a mutually exclusive choice.
Of course not. But surely that's really the last place that you want to be treated by the diversity hire. That's coming up shortly. But first, I want to thank all of my donors on Patreon. I appreciate them all. Patreon is basically a system that allows people to donate $1 or $2 per podcast or per month, and that helps me to devote more time to research and to finding interesting guests. If you could do the same as them, there's details on the website and at the end of the show.
Here's what some people are saying about the Projection Booth podcast.
Week after week, I'm mesmerized by the focus given great films and questionable films alike. But every episode is a learning and entertaining experience.
This is hands down the best movie podcast. They cover so many different genres across so many years, from obscure movies to blockbusters.
If there's only one podcast about movies and cinema that you listen to, make it this one.
The Projection Booth podcast, with new episodes available every week at projectionboothpodcast.com.
Our brains don't really work so well with very small or very large numbers. If I ask you to imagine the distance from the Earth to the Sun, from the Earth to the nearest star, or to the nearest galaxy, it's tempting to just think very, very far in all three cases, even though each one is millions of times bigger than the previous. Similarly, if you try to imagine the size of a bacterium, or a virus, or an atom, you're probably just going to think very small, even though each of those is millions of times smaller than the previous one. For that reason, it's hard to get our heads around some of the statistics that are important for the way the world works. It's hard even to imagine the difference between 1 million and 1 billion. There are a few illustrations out there, but I like this one. Imagine you won $1 million in the lottery and you decided to go on a shopping spree. You spend $1,000 a day. How long will your money last? Answer, less than 3 years. Obviously, I'm ignoring interest and inflation here. This podcast is coming out on Monday, September 23rd, 2019. If you had won that million and started your $1,000 a day shopping spree on Christmas Day 2016, you would have run out of money last Saturday. But what if you had won $1 billion? If you were spending it at the same rate, $1,000 a day, to run out of money about now, you would need to start spending not years ago, not decades ago, not even centuries ago, but thousands of years ago. About 718 BC, to be exact. To finish spending $1 billion at a rate of $1,000 a day, you would have to have started when the pharaohs ruled Egypt, before ancient Rome was even founded. That gives you just an idea of the difference in scale between $1 million and $1 billion. And I think that the reason that many people don't react proportionately sometimes is because our brains can't really process information at a very high or very low scale. But try to keep that comparison between 1 million and 1 billion in mind when I tell you about a criminal trial that's going on at the moment. Keep it in mind because the amount stolen was not 1 billion. It was theft from tax authorities across Europe of about 32 billion euro in Germany, at least 17 billion euro in France, 4.5 billion euro in Italy, and 1.7 billion in little Denmark. That's a total of over 55 billion euro, well over $60 billion. Remember, that example of spending since the time of the pharaohs is only $1 billion. This is vastly more. The trial is still ongoing, but given the vast sums involved, it's astonishing that it has barely registered in the media in the UK, from where the crimes, it is alleged, were committed, or in the other European countries where the taxpayers were ripped off, or anywhere else. It doesn't help that the crimes were very complicated, intentionally so. They involved what's called high-frequency trading, where computerized systems automatically buy and sell vast amounts of shares. They were programmed to produce a vastly complex trail of records that could be represented to the tax authorities to show ownership of very few shares when it came to paying tax on them, or very many shares when it came to claiming tax refunds. Because generating these records with misleading transactions was all automated, the amount that could be stolen was essentially only limited by the amount that the people involved typed into their computers. But the people on trial are not Russian mobsters aided by computer hackers from Macedonia. They're graduates of Oxford University, former employees of Merrill Lynch and Hypo-Vereinsbank, one of the largest banks in Germany, and it's obvious that this scandal touches on many other big European financial institutions. Many of them have legal teams in court observing the trial. There's a lot to be said about the involvement of big banks in financial crime, but the point that I'm trying to make here is that because of the difficulty that humans have in processing very large numbers, we react in irrational ways. Think of the resources put into security in retail bank branches around the country, around the world. Many thousands are spent in every branch making them secure, alerting the police if they're robbed, armed guards, sometimes with police escorts, to drive money shipments around the country. And if they do get robbed, think of the resources put into hunting down, arresting, convicting, and imprisoning the criminals. It wouldn't be uncommon to get 10 or 15 years for a major robbery, say where $100,000 was stolen. But that sort of money wouldn't even count as a rounding error for major white-collar crime. Yet vastly more attention goes to those crimes than to white-collar crime, and certainly they get vastly more effort at both prevention and prosecution than white-collar crime. There's a lot to be said about the fact that the justice system is way more lenient on white-collar criminals, that the public might have a different mental image of criminals if shows like Cops had guys in sharp suits being tased instead of just meth addicts. But I think that a lot of the problem is that they're exploiting the fact that they are stealing so much money that we just don't have the mental facility to understand numbers that large.
Do you agree? Do you disagree? If you want your point of view heard, email podcast@challengingopinions.com and say what you think.
On the line, I have Anthony Galace. He's the Director of Health Equity at an organization called the Greenlining Institute. Anthony, Greenlining, where does that name come from?
Sure, William, and thank you so much for having me. The Greenlining Institute, we're based in California, and we work on issues of racial and economic justice. The word greenlining and the term greenlining is a play on, and we strive ourselves to be the solution to redlining, which is the affirmative practice that was actually perpetuated throughout the United States at levels of the banking and financial services sector and permitted by state and federal governments to perpetuate discrimination, particularly in the housing and financial services market, by which people of color, particularly African Americans, were denied loans and small business and entrepreneurship opportunities simply because of their race. We seek to combat that type of racial discrimination across a multitude of sectors. And in order to do so, we advocate at the state level and the federal level to promote the needs of people of color.
Okay, and as I think I remember it, some banks at least got out a map and put a ruler down on the map and drew a red line and said, people on this side, which just happened to be the minority communities, we don't lend to anybody over there. That's what redlining was, wasn't it?
It was that, and it was so much more. Banks would literally take maps, like you said, and they would color in the areas where they did not want to invest. And one of the most important factors that ultimately lent itself to determining which area was red, green, blue, and yellow, and this was the kind of gradient, the color gradient that they used to determine investment, was the number of African Americans or people of color in that community. You can see it. These maps are still very much present in what we see today in terms of the environmental conditions in those communities. Even though redlining was outlawed throughout the civil rights movement, the legacy of redlining and discrimination and segregation still lives today. And it's going to take a concerted effort across advocates across these various sectors to confront that. And it's what we strive to do.
I can see from your website that you break down your areas of campaigning into health equity,
that's right,
economic equity, energy equity, environmental equity, and so forth. Are you sure all of those are racialized issues? What is energy equity all about?
Sure. So each and every one of our policy areas, you mentioned our energy equity program being one, strive to make sure that we are representing the needs of people of color at every turn. And it's also a recognition that there's been discrimination across all different sectors. And in each one of those, people of color have oftentimes bore the brunt of unfair or lack of access to the products and services. So, for example, in the energy equity sector, there is the multitude of growing clean energy technologies, whether it's electrification and other clean technologies that are being constantly innovated on. Oftentimes, they don't make their way to low-income communities, particularly those with high numbers of people of color. We seek to rectify that by making sure that state and federal agencies that oversee the regulations of these different sectors are working to address that gap and make sure that low-income communities have access to clean energies, clean technologies, and that the businesses doing work to promulgate these technologies are also serving the needs of communities of color. So there's a variety of different advocacy that we do in that sector as well.
But is that just a feature of poverty, essentially, that if you're poorer, then a bigger proportion of your income goes on basic needs like food, rent, energy costs? Does that diverge from the issue of poverty at all?
So, it's very easy to kind of get bogged down and to be sucked into that narrative that it's ultimately the individual's choice, and it's a result of their individual
No. I didn't say that.
decisions.
I didn't say that it was the individual's choice. I'm just saying, is that really anything other than income distribution that's deciding that?
I would say, and I think the data that we've seen says no. And a part of the reason for that is that, so much of what we've done in this country and in the basis of the United States is built off of these structural inequities that have pitted people of color primarily against more well-established and more of affluent populations as well, especially in terms of the decisions that are being made. These are multi-million-dollar investments that occur, and especially when a state or a federal agency decides to make an investment in a community, especially when they're thinking about the return on investment, that oftentimes puts diversity and people of color and diverse communities kind of at the back burner. So we want to confront those decisions. We offer policies that promote clean energy technology and that make sure that state governments and the United States federal government is investing in communities, particularly those that are hit first and worst by climate catastrophes and climate change.
Okay, I understand what you're saying there, but what I want to get at there, and this is perhaps linked with the rise of the vote for Donald Trump and populism in other countries, that for sure there is a strong correlation between minorities and lower incomes, but that's by no means a perfect correlation. And you can say that perhaps on average black women have less opportunities than white men in the United States. But if that black woman is Malia Obama and that white man is a coal miner in West Virginia who dropped out of high school and has been working in a coal mine since he was 16 and is now 40 and too sick to work and with no health insurance, there's no way in hell that you could say that those particular individuals represent the whole. And if somebody, isn't it attractive to an individual white person? We know that young white males are actually not doing so well in the job market now. Is it really helpful to use the minority tag? Shouldn't it just be anyone who's disadvantaged?
Well, we believe, first of all, that when we promote diversity, when we promote inclusion and equity, that everybody benefits. And right now, we're seeing an economy that is not only being favored towards the wealthy, but that's also perpetuating various forms of discrimination that we strive to confront and reject at every turn. So it's not just that we're advocating for communities of color, for African Americans, Latinos, but we believe that the policies of diversity and of inclusion actually benefit everyone. So when you talk about, and you compare Malia Obama, for example, to a struggling white man living in coal country, we think that, first of all, everybody can and should benefit from clean technology. That when you brought up the energy equity point earlier, the more clean technologies we get out, and the more that people have access to them, the better off each and every community is. So whether it's a low-income individual that's white or black or Latino or Asian, oftentimes because of their conditions, but because of the opportunities that they have been denied through the economic marketplace, we want to make sure that we're creating systems that permit them greater access to those opportunities. And again, whether that's clean energy, access to healthcare, access to a job, access to a home, so on and so forth. A lot of these same systems have been built up against low-income communities, but we also have to recognize the fact that those communities are disproportionately of color. That's just a fact. And we hope to, that's something that we're trying to strive towards.
And that's absolutely true, disproportionately. Yeah. But there are exceptions to that.
Sure. Of course there are exceptions. And what we can also say is that, the nation as a whole is taking steps every single day. We're seeing the demographics shift towards one that's becoming more of a diverse nation. I think it's, by 2045, at least in the 2040s, the United States as a whole will be a majority minority nation. And, unless we confront the disparities of race and wealth together, unless we are explicit about the factors that created these conditions and offer solutions that confront them at their core, we're going to continue to create and perpetuate these same problems. And that's why, we see the work that we do across every sector, not just as a racial issue, but as an economic issue as well, because they're so intertwined. Okay.
The U.S. is a very divided country at the moment. And I think you'd acknowledge that division runs along racial lines, perhaps not perfectly so, but certainly to a significant degree. And one of the reasons for that is because of prejudice and because of the legacy of racism and racial division and so forth. But it doesn't help to exacerbate that, does it? I'm looking at one line on your website here, and it's about environmental equity. And one bullet point that you suggest is help communities of color adapt to climate change. How on earth would climate change? The climate is the same for everybody. Why does race need to be brought into that?
Well, again, this is not just a racial issue. It's an economic one as well. And we make that connection very clear because so often the decisions that are made to prop up a community or to invest in a community is still very much based on, it still has a disproportionate impact on communities of color. And in many cases, those populations still don't get the investment that they need in order to thrive and live healthy lives. So when you talk about climate change in particular, when you look, for example, at an affluent and white neighborhood, particularly in the state of California, and I'm going to use this state simply because that's where we operate in, the impacts of climate change, while the temperatures may be similar in one community versus another, their access, again, to a highly efficient AC unit, or their access to solar panels, their access to clean investments or to green space is vastly different. That is not just a climate investment issue, but that's a local zoning issue. That's a housing issue. And ultimately, again, these decisions are not only on economic lines, but on racial lines as well. So we want to make sure that we're telling both sides of that story. If we only talk about low-income communities, which is an admirable goal to serve low-income communities, we're missing the fact that people of color are disproportionately low income, and that inequity is because of centuries worth of disinvestment, segregation, and discrimination. And unless the government works towards confronting those issues and solving those problems, and is actively engaged in improving conditions for those hit first and worst by climate change, then we're not going to make any progress. So in order, again, when the government goes about and expands its investments in clean technology and places solar panels on buildings, we want to make sure they're doing that in every community, not just the wealthiest.
Your specialty is health equity. Tell me exactly what the Greenlining Institute is campaigning for. How do you view, clearly medical care is a very hot issue. It's going to be a hot issue in the 2020 election. What are you advocating? Well,
it's been a hot issue for many election cycles now. And one thing that I fervently believe is that, the healthcare sector and the health sector in general is the new frontier of the civil rights movement. It was Dr. King who actually said that of all the forms of inequality, I believe he said, injustice in healthcare is the most shocking and inhumane. And I believe it's a clear injustice when, people of color, by and large, are still denied the type of access to care and the quality of care that will ultimately allow them to live healthy lives. There was a study, I believe, in 2016.
That's the problem. That's the problem. What's the solution?
Sure. The solution is, for example, number one, we need to make sure that everybody has access to healthcare. There are various policies being shared every single day that look to expand and to reimagine what the healthcare system looks like. But at the same time, we think that any proposal put forth needs to make sure everyone has access to care, but also that we need to make sure that everybody who seeks care is cared for in a way that is that reflects and is understanding of their experiences. So one of the things that we advocate for on a policy front is to make sure that the next generation of healthcare professionals reflects the diversity of the patients. Going back to one of the challenges we face, there was a study in 2016 that shared that physicians being trained across the country, some of which still have the belief that Black patients feel less pain than white patients. This was out of the University of Virginia. That's just astonishing that in 2016, medical students who are being trained every single day in one of the most specialized fields in the world can still have these preconceived notions rooted in racism. Mm-hmm. So, one way that we believe we need to confront that is by having a more diverse health workforce, but also one that's trained to meet the needs of all patients, regardless of their identity, but is culturally competent, and is willing to serve them at every turn.
Yeah, I noticed that on your website, and it says, and this is on your section of the organization, people get better care and are more likely to seek care if they can see health professionals who look and sound like them. I don't want health professionals who look and sound like me. I want health professionals who are competent and well trained. Sure. Surely the only criteria for, above all, a doctor is whether they can do the job.
Right. And we believe that it's not a mutually exclusive choice.
Of course not. But surely that's really the last place that you want to be treated by the diversity hire.
Absolutely. But whether or not someone is a quote unquote diversity hire, we want to abolish this notion. And again, we want to confront this notion that would mean substandard care. Right. This notion that we are promoting diversity over the quality of care is simply false. And we see them as working hand in hand. And right now, we're also seeing a failing healthcare system where people of color don't have the access to care that they need. And another study and multitude of studies have shown actually that Black women have the mortality rate in terms of their maternal and child health are 3 times higher than white women. That's a crisis. That's a public health crisis we're facing in this nation, in large part due to the fact that there are not enough Black women who are doctors. We did a study in 2017 that interviewed women physicians of color across the nation and found stark disparities in how they were educated, how they were trained, and ultimately how they were empowered amongst their patients. That there's still this notion that if you see a woman of color in a hospital, the assumption is that she's not going to be a leader, or that doesn't have the training specialty she needs to care for somebody. And that's simply false.
That's an important thing, and that's a serious
Absolutely.
problem. But isn't it an entirely separate problem from the fact that poorer people in the US, who, as you say, are disproportionately minorities, have poor access to healthcare? Are you sure that it's a good idea to mix those two different issues? Because the solution to one is not always the solution to the other.
It's not. But they are connected. They are connected in that as we work to expand care, as we work to make sure that every patient can see a doctor and doesn't have to go bankrupt in order to seek the medical care that they need, we also have to make sure that the care that they receive is one that will ultimately make them healthy. If you go to the doctor and you spend a lot of money and there's so much effort to see the doctor, you obviously have to go through a series of tests. You have to pay your copay, so on and so forth. But you don't ultimately receive good care because of it. All that will be for naught. And we want to avoid that. We want to make sure that doesn't become the reality in the United States of America by making sure everybody, every patient seeks the best quality care. And in order to do that, we need more diversity. We need more inclusion. And we're better off when we have a more equitable playing field to start from. And that includes having people of color.
Anthony, you're speaking so enthusiastically that I think you got away from me on one particular question. I asked you, what's the solution on that? Are you supporting Medicare for all?
You know what? We are non-sectarian right now when it comes to the variety of policies. And that's only because every single day there's a new healthcare proposal being put forth. But we believe that any proposal, any healthcare reform put forth needs to make sure that everybody has quality access to care, that it doesn't put anybody into bankruptcy, but also that everybody has high quality care. Those three central tenets have been at the forefront of one party's viewpoints. And that comes as a stark contrast to what we're seeing with the current administration that celebrates denying people health care, that celebrates.
You mentioned that's at the forefront of one party. I guess you mean the Democrats.
That's right.
It may have been, but not entirely. And you're based in Oakland in California, and really just around the Bay is Nancy Pelosi, represents the 12th district, which is mostly San Francisco. She has been less than enthusiastic about the more radical freshman members of Congress.
She has.
She might be being rational there, because what she wants is not to get a very small enthusiastic vote that some people like AOC got. She wants to get across the line, to get 51%, or to get Democrats to control the presidency and potentially also the Senate. Isn't it true that although she may be less ambitious, she might be more likely to be successful by being a moderate?
Well, what I will say is this. The debate that's being had right now about how to go about reforming our healthcare system, so long as there's consistencies around wanting to expand care and improve quality, that's the debate that should be had. And that's the debate that I think every single American is interested in having, rather than one that's seeking to strip healthcare from everyone else. And to your point, to your question about, the speaker's position as more of a incremental approach versus a transformative healthcare system that includes everyone, that's already playing out in this presidential election. And we're seeing factions across the country in large numbers supporting a Medicare for all system. But again, I think that whatever proposal is put forth and whatever one is ultimately endorsed by either the next president or the next Congress needs to be based on a few simple principles. And that is, again, making sure everyone has access to healthcare, and that healthcare is high quality for everyone, regardless of their identity.
I want to move on to just one other topic, and I see you talk about technology equity as well. And one of the things you list, or you list quite prominently as the challenge, is that minorities have considerably less access to the internet at home than white people in particular.
Yeah.
Home internet, only a few short years ago, was a very narrow interest, and not very many people were even interested in having it. Isn't it the case that things that were luxuries a short time ago are now being seen as almost necessities? That's a mark of progress, isn't it?
No, it's not a mark of progress. But what is a mark of progress is making sure that is perpetuating the same types of inequities and disparities in the digital divide that we've seen in terms of our economic systems. And it does no one any good when you are using the tools of today, our vast technologies and the innovation that we're seeing to further disadvantage one group versus another. That, in anything, is a mockery of progress. And that's why we work every single day, our tech equity team, to make sure that whether it's the newest technologies being created every single day, that those investments are working towards employing people of color, that the tech sector is working to distribute its new innovations to the communities that need it most. And ultimately, one area that they're also very active on is making sure that when tech companies and these tech giants are collecting vast amounts of information, most of which is not known to the user, that's not being used again to further disadvantage people by marketing products to a certain community that they otherwise wouldn't to another, or by making assumptions about a patient's health and wellness that would infringe upon their privacy. So those are some of the things that, again, if the tech sector perpetuates those inequities, that's a mockery towards progress. I think if we want to take progress and move forward as a society, we need to do so in a way that's fair and just. And anything other than that, I think moves us backwards.
Anthony, final question. Are you optimistic for the future?
I get this question a lot, and my answer is of course I am, because I have no other choice. In a world where I hope to raise my own family, where I hope to leave a legacy of my own, it wouldn't do me any good to be cynical about the future. So, whether, despite all the challenges that we face as a country, and as a globe, as a nation, the globe faces, I think that optimism is necessary if we're willing to confront these challenges. So absolutely, I am.
Anthony Galace, Director of Health Equity at the Greenlining Institute, thank you very much for talking to me.
Thank you so much, William. Appreciate you.
If you like the Challenging Opinions podcast, please rate and review the show on iTunes and other podcast providers. Share it on Facebook and Twitter. Tell your friends. But most important, make your view heard. Email podcast@challengingopinions.com.
Go to the website for sources and links to what we were talking about. And while you're there, please like the show on Facebook, follow @ChallengingO on Twitter, and follow the Greenlining Institute @Greenlining. And get in touch with me if you can suggest a guest or a topic for a future show. And thanks again to everyone who's signed up as a patron on Patreon so far. I really appreciate that. It means that I can devote more time to research and finding interesting guests. And if you could do the same as them and donate $1 or $2 per podcast or per month, you can go to patreon.com/challengingopinions or find a link on my website. You can do all of that, find out how to subscribe to the podcast for free on your computer, your phone, or by email, or get in touch with me. It's all at www.challengingopinions.com. Coming up next Monday, that's September 30th, I'll be talking to the political scientist Stephen Taylor. The Challenging Opinions podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. Thank you for listening.